Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Raven Pearson Bobwick. I'm a double major in business management and peace and justice studies. And yeah, I'm excited to be with you guys today, and I hope that this workshop is beneficial and impactful for all of you.
So Raven and I are both members of the leadership team of Get Woke Nova, which is a campus campaign that started in the spring of 2017, actually as a senior project from a few communication students. And they were really interested in looking at the intersections of dialogue and campus activism. And so that was kind of the roots of the campaign, and it's really blossomed in the last several years into so much more than I think what it started as. So not only are we a social media campaign that really focuses on platforming the voices of marginalized students and allies on Villanova's campus, but we also, in a non-COVID world, also do a lot of on-campus events, collaborations with different organizations and colleges on campus, and then other things like wish walls, which you may have seen around campus in the past. And so, yeah, with that being said, I think I'll have Raven talk a little bit more about how you can get involved with Get Woke Nova in the future.
Yeah, so like Chloe said, like one of the major parts of Get Woke Nova is our social media campaign and posting those stories specifically to Instagram. And so one of the ways that you can definitely just get involved and kind of see what we are doing is to follow us on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and then to share a post with your friends, because that is really kind of the bulk of like how we get our word out there and how we share the injustices that other students on our campus face. And then next, like Chloe said, to support our events on campus in a non-COVID world, we would definitely have a lot more and different types of events like the wish walls, doing these workshops, but in person, and other things like that. And we would always like post about these events on our social medias. And then lastly, we encourage you guys to share and send us your stories. You can do it via email or through our Instagram DMs. And you're always welcome to send a story anonymously if you don't want to have your name attached to the story that you want to share. We really, really appreciate and love getting these stories and being able to share them out to the entire student body. So we definitely want you guys to consider it for the future.
Okay. And so basically, this is an allyship workshop that we typically do on campus, where we share a few marginalized student stories and their experiences on Villanova's campus. And it's very interactive. So after we read the story, we'll ask you all a few questions and kind of unpack the story. So the first story is from Chidinma Chioke, and she's a senior in VSB. And she says, "My name is Chidinma Chioke, and I am a junior business analytics and finance double major. I was born and raised in Lagos, Nigeria, and I moved to the US 2 years ago for college. Coming to a country where I was in the coming from a country where I was in the majority, I had never felt the abject marginalization I felt when I arrived here. There's an experience at VSB that occurred during my freshman year that remains permanent in my mind, because it made me feel very small. It was the first week of class, and I'd found a spot in the front of one of my classes. I was the only POC in class. POC means person of color. The professor walked in and put a question on the board and said he wanted to hear everyone's perspective, but he'd call on the students so that the class didn't get rowdy. I watched him call on everyone in the class except for me. I was sort of confused, so I met with him after class, and he apologized, saying he hadn't seen me. I was sitting in the front of the class. I learned quickly that as a Black woman in America, your life is going to be a constant struggle. I found myself constantly grappling with my self-identity and the responsibility and neglect that came with being a Black woman in America. You have to demand to be merely acknowledged. Despite all of the obstacles, I made a conscious decision to keep working hard, to honor those that came before me. And if you know me, you know I kept my word." And so I want to take a moment to get some of your kind of initial reactions from Chidinma's story. So one word reactions or one phrase about how this story made you feel or what it's making you think. And feel free to just take yourself off mute and speak into the silence.
Good morning. My name is William Parkin. So I know a lot of women who are in the business school, and I've had several conversations with them, and they've told me that it's definitely hard being a woman in the business school to begin with. And I can imagine that it's probably harder to not only be a woman in the business school, but to be an African-American woman in business school. So having the ability to speak out like that, I think that's quite courageous of her.
Thank you for sharing, William. Does anyone else have any initial reactions to Chi-Chi's story that they would like to share? In the chat, a professor said, as a professor, it's heartbreaking to hear. Invisibility is never something students should experience in a classroom. Yeah, and I think that definitely resonates with me as well. I think her story is about feeling invisible at Villanova, and I'm curious to hear other people's perspectives around what that invisibility means, especially as a Black woman. Does anyone want to share like their perspective on Chidinma's experience with feeling invisible at Villanova? All right, that's okay. It takes a long time, I think, to process these experiences that people have faced. Oh, got one more in the chat. Did he not see her, or did he choose to ignore? And I think that speaks to the struggle that a lot of marginalized students experience. Is there's a constant questioning of with microaggressions like this, or did he really not see me, or is this a racist encounter that I'm facing? And so I just encourage you all to think about that experience and what that feeling is like for someone like Chi-Chi, to be in a class and to feel invisible. Raven, do you want to move to the next story?
Yeah, and I just also wanted to add just something like that I think about, that I encourage you all to think about as well, is that oftentimes if you hear, when you hear stories from marginalized and people of color on this campus, there's a mix between feeling invisible in the classroom, but then you also feel like, you can't help but stand out because there just aren't that many people of color on this campus. And so, personally, like I walk around and I feel like, are there eyes on me? Do people, see who I am? Not that I'm not proud of that, but then there also comes with that kind of internal thing, like, do they see me and are they choosing to ignore? So it's just kind of something I encourage you guys to think about, because I think that's really interesting, kind of, I don't know, just kind of very interesting, like feel seen, but then to also feel invisible and like not taken seriously or heard at the same time, that I think a lot of students on this campus feel. But like I said, I'm going to move on to the next story, which was submitted to us by Leah McCaffery. And so one of the first promises that I made myself as a high school senior was that I would be 100% me at Villanova. Part of that promise was coming out and taking pride in my identity as a gay man. Unfortunately, other LGBT plus students on our campus do not enjoy the same luxury of feeling comfortable in his or their own skin in that queer identity. At first, I was terrified of being noticed for acting gay. But the most important lesson that I learned on this campus is that being me and living my truth is enough. Facing the initial discomfort of being vulnerable by vocalizing my identity was difficult, but ultimately liberating. Don't conceal or conform because others may not understand your identity. I am a proud Villanovan, but it's important to remember that being gay and a Villanova student are not mutually exclusive. It's time to cultivate a more inclusive dialogue that allows for students of differing races and sexual orientations to feel represented and heard on our campus. So once again, that was from Leah McCaffery, who was a communication and Spanish double major. So similar to the last story that Chloe just shared with us, does anyone have just any initial one-word thoughts or phrases that they'd like to share?
Yeah, something in this that kind of struck me is that he was terrified of being noticed for acting gay, which I think is definitely a concern of a lot of like LGBT students on campus. I know I've had the experience of people saying that like, oh, you don't like look gay, and that's kind of like interesting because it's like, well, that doesn't invalidate me. So there's this constant like what you should be, but also like, are you too much? Are you not enough? And it's like your identity isn't necessarily valid unless it falls into what people's boxes should be.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing that, Morgan. I definitely agree that there's kind of this can be this like kind of rhetoric that if you don't fall into a certain box, then you don't identify as that identity, and like what does it even mean to like act gay, and like why do we as a society think that that's okay to even like put onto someone or like make someone fear just for them being their identity, that it's they're acting in a way that they shouldn't. So I definitely agree with what you're saying, and thank you so much for sharing. And does anyone else have any initial thoughts or reactions to any part of Liam's story?
Someone said in the chat, being someone who struggled to come out for many years, I still feel the pressure of acting like myself here at Villanova. I've received comments about the way I'm acting and how I don't belong here because I don't fit the norm. Thank you for sharing. I'm curious to hear if anyone else kind of feels the same sentiment or maybe feels differently. Like, how inclusive do you feel Villanova is of people in the LGBTQ community? And maybe what ways do you think that Villanova could do better to be more inclusive of the wide range, I think, of people within the community? Someone said, yes, I want to learn how we can do better. And honestly, I think that's a really good segue into like the next portion of the workshop. So Raven, do you want to switch to the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay. So part of this workshop is all about like better understanding what it means to be an ally and what allyship really means. So I'm curious to hear a few definitions or a few examples of what you understand allyship to mean, or what allyship looks like to you. So feel free to just speak into the silence.
I think it means about doing a better job of listening and trying to understand so that we can hopefully move forward and be more inclusive as a community, as a campus. That's what I think about when it comes to allyship. I understand though that it's somewhat of a charged word right now. And I'm trying to figure out how do we get to that place of listening and understanding.
Okay, yeah, I'm hearing listening and understanding. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to add to the definition of allyship or what it means to be an ally?
To me, it means taking the perspective of the other person very seriously and not to inject your own notion of who that person should be, so that person feels respected. If not loved, which is the ultimate goal, respected.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's about respect. It's about understanding a different perspective. And any other definitions or examples of what allyship is?
I think part of it is also being an ally for somebody when they're not in the room, like keeping the support when you're not with them, and taking the time to become more educated and not relying on them to educate you, and just to be there for support. And as somebody mentioned, listen to learn, don't listen to speak.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. I think that's a really great understanding of what allyship is. And I was actually doing like an online module recently about allyship and about inclusive leadership. And I really liked the definition of allyship that the course offered. And I'm just going to read it out because I think it really speaks to all of what you all said. And so it says, allyship is an active, consistent, and ongoing practice of unlearning and reevaluating, in which a person in a position of privilege and power seeks to operate in solidarity with a targeted group. Practicing allyship is not a linear process. It requires ongoing self-reflection and learning. And I think I like that definition because it speaks to the fact that as people of privilege, we have to unlearn certain habits. And I think that's really the beginning of allyship, is how can we unlearn some of the prejudices and biases that we may hold, just naturally. But it also speaks to, I think, the support that a lot of people were talking about, is how can we stand in solidarity with marginalized communities. And then I also really like that it talked about it not being a linear process. Allyship is all about learning and constantly learning. I myself am still learning to be an ally. And I think that sometimes, just like allyship is a charged word, woke is a charged word. And there is this feeling that, like, I think there's a feeling that, one day you just reach this stage of transcendence and you're all of a sudden ally, or you're all of a sudden woke. And that's really not the case. It's a constant process. It's consistent, it's active, and you're learning to be an ally throughout your entire life. And so hopefully the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about tips for how to be a better ally on campus, and we'll help you unpack some of those tips. So Raven, can you go to the next slide?
Yes, and I actually believe that the next slide was a story that we had received from Rebecca Del Rossi, but it does touch a lot on, like these words, like what it means to be an ally, or the woke and privilege. And so it definitely will tie in a lot to what we were just discussing. So once again, this is from Rebecca Del Rossi, and it says, a lot of the time, I think that people believe that the notion of privilege is an attack on their personal achievements. At first, my dad believed it to be. When I first brought up the term to him on a phone call home, he heatedly told me, your mother and I worked our asses off for us to have our privilege. And this is true for me and a lot of us who go to school here at Villanova. We are from hardworking and dedicated families that are fortunate enough to send us to this amazing school. However, being hardworking does not equate to being privileged. I do not have to worry about getting a job because of my race. I feel safe, not scared around police officers. I have never been called a racial slur. I know people don't make biased assumptions about me based on the color of my skin. Essentially, privilege is experiences and backgrounds that we take for granted and that give us certain benefits that people of color don't receive. After that phone call, my dad and I had another talk after he reflected on the term. He realized that yes, he does have privilege, and he recognized how it's helped him throughout his life. It is possible to work hard and be proud of your individual accomplishments, but we as white people need to recognize the systemic benefits we receive because of the color of our skin. Only then can we become allies and get woke. So this definitely does tie into what Chloe was just talking about and what you all were sharing about being an ally, and how it is, definitely a process of unlearning and relearning something, whether that be terminology, or even reflecting on past experiences. And so I'm curious to see if any of you guys have any reactions or thoughts about how this can connect to allyship, or just about this story in general.
I just wanted to add on to the last slide that I really feel like the want to be an ally is accompanied by the want to continue to learn. How there's just never an end to really seeing other people's experiences, because from those experiences we can learn pretty much the downsides where our society is failing. And so experiences for me, I work for an ambulance company in a predominantly white place. And it was a real shock to me when I had a police officer who pretty much overlooked a Hispanic family just because they couldn't speak English, and he didn't even care. He was like, just throw in the ambulance, and it was just not the right way that someone should be treated. And I think ever since that day, it was amazing to me, because everyone knows that there is police brutality, but the fact that he wasn't willing to give someone the basic needs of medicine to care for someone, that was a hard thing to look at. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, William, for sharing that. That's a really powerful story. And I think it ties into this idea of the disparities that we see within society, within healthcare, within education, and many other things, solely based on race and ethnicity. And so, like, what does that mean for us, as Villanovans and as people who are striving to be allies? Like, what can we do to help ensure that situations like that can be minimized? Because we know that they still happen frequently, often, and one can argue that they are getting worse as time goes on. But reading these stories and talking about allyship, we can see that they are ultimately prevented. But that comes from a constant desire to want to be better and to want society as a whole to be better. So I definitely appreciate you sharing that. And if anyone else has anything they'd like to share, please feel free.
Rebecca's story definitely resonates with me as somebody with, parents in another generation of family members. And, the notion that allyship isn't a linear thing also resonates with me, because I find it, I don't know if easier is the word, but more comfortable to act as an ally with people of my own generation, or people who I'm not, I guess, afraid of offending. But when it comes to my own family, my parents, who, grew up in a different kind of world and who certainly mean well, it can be hard to speak up and not be afraid of hurting someone, hurting the feelings of somebody you love. They, say something that's a little misguided or outdated or offensive. And they might not, mean it that way and get a little defensive. So this certainly resonates with me as somebody who feels very strongly about becoming a better ally, but can sometimes, ebb and flow in what I'm willing to, I guess, put on the line. And that's my own privilege that I don't, I have that ability to take a step back if I feel uncomfortable. And that's something I can definitely work on.
Thanks for sharing that, Emily. I think that that really speaks to Rebecca's story really well, because you see that she had a conversation with her dad, and then it wasn't until later that she had another phone call and that he reflected on the term. And so I think that is that really speaks to the importance of the allyship continuum. There's a lot of different definitions of what allyship is, and there is a lot of steps into becoming an ally. So, and I know that someone asked me actually in the chat, how allyship has become a charged word. And I think it's become charged because people perceive allyship as passive. And there are new words, I think, now to talk about allyship in a more active way. So thinking about allyship as not passive, but an active way of being an accomplice, and really standing beside people of marginalized backgrounds. And so I think that is why it's become charged, is because it takes a lot to get beyond the step of just saying you're an ally, or recognizing that these things are bad and then moving to the step of actually acting against them and speaking against them. And the more you speak out, the easier it will become. And so I think that speaks to the fact that, allyship isn't a linear process. It takes a lot of time to get used to speaking out and knowing the right things to say and knowing the right terminology and knowing how to defend, defend your perspective. And so, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Emily. And we just got another comment in the chat, and it says, I think that the quote from Rebecca is very powerful. I think that people react very defensively to being labeled as privileged because they think it negates the hard work that they've put into getting to where they are. But I think it has to do because the term privilege itself has been largely interpreted to mean an active and consciously biased recipient of benefits and access. Often the implicit and unconscious benefits that one receives as a function of their identity is overlooked. And I totally agree with that, Rishti. I think that even privilege is a trigger word for a lot of people because they associate privilege with racism or the fact that they haven't, been dealt difficult hands in life. And I think that it's really important to understand intersectionality in the whole kind of the whole picture, right, of what it means to have different identities. So yes, Rebecca's dad is a white man and he has privilege because of that, but he also may have come from a lower socioeconomic status and that may have added additional hardships to his life. And so I think it's important to understand that you can be an ally even though you may have a certain privileged identity. So for me, I am a woman, which puts me at a disadvantage in many cases. I'm also biracial, I'm Black, but I'm white passing. And so for me, I always strive to be an ally to my Black peers who are of darker complexion and who go through so many more, I think, challenges than I do based on the color of my skin. And so I think that is hopefully an example of what intersectionality looks like and what it means to recognize your privilege, but also recognize that you may have been dealt a difficult hand too. Raven, do you have anything you want to add?
I think just definitely reiterating what was said about how, the term privilege doesn't minimize your past accomplishments and all the things that you've done by, being saying that you are a white man and you have that privilege of not experiencing racial stereotypes and discriminations. It's not to say that what you've done with your life and how far you've come, isn't, I guess, for lack of a better word, isn't counted or isn't appreciated, because it definitely is. It's just also being able to take a step back and recognize how your life could have been different and how it may be different for other people of color and from marginalized communities. And so I just think that's also really important to highlight. But if no one else has anything else that they'd like to share, we're going to kind of shift gears back to talking about allyship and allyship tips. We always like to share a couple at the end of our workshop because we find them to be really beneficial. So let me okay.
All right, and while you're shifting that, also we got another message in the chat that says, Dr. Taylor in the MLK keynote last night held up critique of allyship as it can be seen as helping those who are weak or unable to stand up on their own. Racism is systemic, so we need to change for us so that we are better with each other. As a person of that generation, I hope that younger people don't assume how I think or what I understand. Yeah, thank you, Noreen. I really like that we need to change for us because racism and other aspects of marginalization do impact people in privileged groups negatively, right? And so it's important to recognize and take ownership of the fact that by not participating in being an ally, you are contributing to a systemic oppression. And so hopefully these allyship tips are going to help you unpack, a few simple ways of how you can be an ally in your everyday life here at Villanova. whether that's in specific student organizations you're a part of, or in the classroom, or in your social life. And so what I'll do is I'll read through these 3 tips, and then I'll ask for just a couple of examples of ways you think that you can do these in your everyday life. So the first is, an ally recognizes that allyship is a constant learning process. You can do this by checking your privilege on a regular basis and engaging in dialogue that challenges your worldview. An ally does not expect a reward. You can do this by doing the right thing regardless of whether or not you'll be thanked or compensated for it. And the last one is, an ally works to recognize and adjust implicit biases. You can do this by learning to engage in uncomfortable conversations about privilege. So feel free to speak into the silence and just share an example of a way that you think you can do one of these 3 tips in your everyday life.
I think just being willing to make mistakes as you're learning, and then when you make those mistakes, recognizing them and knowing that, yes, making a mistake is obviously, you never want to do something that could offend someone, but it also is a good way to start a conversation about other things that like is appropriate and what's not, and to start a discussion with everyone about what they're comfortable with, and setting that like standard for everyone and helping educate within the conversation.
Thank you, Morgan. Let's get one more example, and then we can move on to the next slide.
To the second box, I think Dr. Taylor's point last night about allyship, like really targeted the concept of like the white savior complex. And so I think, and like recognizing that like you're not helping or you're not trying to be an ally for the recognition. And I think just checking yourself and making sure that you're trying to be an ally for the right reasons is very important.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia. Raven, do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah. Okay, so next we have another set of 3 allyship tips. So an ally understands that one person does not speak on behalf of an entire marginalized community. You can do this by asking someone to speak from their own experience, not expecting them to represent an entire group. An ally lets go of some of the levels of their privilege. You can do this by being aware of the space you take up. An ally actively listens and responds to concerns that a member of a marginalized group expresses. You can do this by taking the time to listen to others, remove distractions, and set aside biases during your discussions. So similar to the last slide, if anyone wants to share any examples of how they can apply these allyship tips to their daily lives.
I'm noticing that a lot of people went to Dr. Taylor's talk last night, and I have to agree with all of them that a lot of her points were really sound. And I really like how the first first box talks about how like one person does not speak for everything or for everyone. And she really spoke about that last night, how Martin Luther King only started the conversation, that so many people have come after him and wrote about it and continue developing the conversation to the point where you can't look away anymore. So I thought that was a really good point that she was stressing last night.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing that, William. And I think that, along with that, there becomes this kind of balance of making sure that you appreciate, you recognize, and you truly listen to the stories and experiences shared by those of marginalized communities, but then not putting that one story on a pedestal, like that's the only, discrimination they may experience. That's the only thing that you are, I don't really know how to say it, but like that's all that there is, because clearly every single person goes through life differently and will experience different things and interpret them, differently just because of their perspective. So it's kind of a balance of recognizing the faults within society, but then also knowing that like that one fault that you may hear is just one of an infinite amount that people can experience throughout their lives. Does anyone else want to share how they can apply these allyship tips? If not, that's okay. We can move to the.
We got
Oh, what were you gonna say, Chloe?
They said, I'm a faculty in VSB, and the first point resonates a lot with me. I think it's so important to hear diverse voices in the classroom, but also to realize that everyone is a function of their intersectional identities and that every person's experiences can be different. Yeah, thank you, Rishti. I think it is really important to recognize that like you do have such I think a diversity of students in the classroom, but that because of our intersectional identities, everyone's experiences are different. And so asking someone to, speak for their race or speak for their gender isn't going to get a whole picture, right? Because an entire gender or an entire race or an entire ethnicity is, not a monolith, right? And so the best thing that you can do is just speak for yourself, right? And speak from the I perspective of this is how I feel about this, or this is my experience. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and so I think next we'll just move to we have one last slide of tips we'd like to share with you guys.
Okay. The first tip is an ally empathizes with others and understands their cultural differences and backgrounds. You can do this by being open-minded and connecting with those around you. An ally proactively engages in diversity initiatives and conversations around them. You can do this by starting a conversation to continuously learn about diversity initiatives. An ally accepts and supports all people. You can do this by saying hello, welcoming the person, involving the person in conversations, and incorporating them into the group. So let's just get one more tip or one more example of a way you can incorporate these tips into your everyday life. I think we got one in the chat, actually. Lauren says, these tips are so helpful. To me, it's about applying a growth mindset as an ally and going back to your original point. It's not a linear journey to a continuous learning. Yeah, thank you. Any other examples of how you can incorporate one of these tips into your life?
I think just going into a conversation with somebody, no matter who they are, no matter what their background is just have no previous assumptions and just really go in with an open mind and expect that it's going to be a good conversation and you're going to learn something. And it's not just like using your own experience to make those judgments about somebody before you even get to know them.
Yeah, absolutely, Molly. Thank you. And Braven, I think you can move to the next slide. Okay, so this is the end of our presentation. If you don't already follow us at Get Woke Nova on Instagram, you can see all of our previous stories of the last several years and some of the initiatives that we've done. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them now. Anything about our campaign or about this presentation, we're happy to answer any questions.
I have a question about both you, Chloe, and Raven. You both used the word unlearning. I was just wondering if you could maybe touch upon that just to explain a little bit more about what that would maybe look like.
Yeah, I think that unlearning goes along with like also learning, right? So I think that an example of unlearning something is like, let's say you come from a town that maybe is predominantly white, right? And you have maybe prejudices about specific racial groups or specific, I don't know, a specific marginalized community because you haven't been exposed to them. Unlearning the process of unlearning would involve you learning more about, I think, your own prejudices and learning how to correct them. So maybe you had like preconceived notions prior to this and that were homophobic or transphobic, and it's a huge process of unlearning that, right, and correcting it in the future. So for me, as an example, I have spent, I think, the last couple of years of learning a lot more about the transgender community and about non-binary people and the importance of pronouns, using pronouns in my everyday life. And so I've had to unlearn, I think, the gender binary and learn more about what it means to be inclusive to people who don't necessarily subscribe to the gender binary, people who use they, them pronouns or ze, them pronouns, and are gender non-binary. So that's an example, I think, of unlearning is like prior to the last couple of years, I think I only understood gender as, you know, man and woman. And it's taken unlearning that to be a better ally to people who are marginalized. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, everyone. If you have any questions or you're looking to get involved with Get Woke in any other ways, feel free to DM us on Instagram or email us at our Gmail account. So thank you, everyone, and I really appreciate you all joining us for this Freedom School session.
Yeah, thank everybody for coming. We hope you enjoyed the workshop and that you found it helpful.